Tonight, we uncover a secret buried beneath centuries of silence, a legend whispered through rain and stone, hidden not in deserts or cathedrals, but under the mist of the Scottish Highlands. For generations, stories of the Knights Templar have been dismissed as myth, their treasure lost, their order destroyed. But what if they never vanished at all? What if they fled north, carrying something the Church could never allow to surface? Beneath the soil of Scotland lie ruins older than castles, chambers carved with symbols that hum when touched by light, and echoes of rituals long forgotten. This isn't just about buried gold or relics of faith. It's about an idea so dangerous it had to be hidden in the earth itself. A covenant written in stone, guarded by clans, and protected by silence. Beneath these hills may rest the last testimony of an order that defied both kings and popes. So before you look away, ask yourself, what if the greatest secret of the Templars was never lost, only waiting? Like the video, subscribe, because tonight we descend beneath the Highlands, and what waits below might change everything we thought we knew about history. The wind over the Scottish Highlands is not just air, it is memory. It moves through the heather like a whisper, too old to belong to the living. The scent of peat smoke lingers, soft and sweet, wrapping around ruined stones that no one has touched in centuries. Somewhere far off, a bell tolls, one long note carried by the mist, and for a brief second it feels like time itself has stopped to listen. People say the Templars vanished in the year 1307, burned, scattered, erased. But what if they never left at all? What if instead of fleeing, they went beneath the earth, beneath the story, beneath the heather? That is where our journey begins. Imagine standing alone on a Highland moor at twilight. The ground feels hollow under your boots. The air tastes of metal and rain. You hear something beneath the soil, a sound like breath caught between stone. Locals call it the sleeping field. They say no sheep graze there, no flowers root there, and no compass behaves. There are places in Scotland where the land remembers more than it should, where churches are built over older sanctuaries and crosses, stand where circles once were. The Knights Templar were experts at such layers, builders, warriors, and keepers of secrets. When their order fell, when the Pope branded them heretics, they scattered like sparks into the dark corners of Europe. But not all sparks die. Some fall and catch again. In the north, whispers tell of ships that left from La Rochelle under the cover of fog. Ships that carried not gold or relics, but something far heavier, something that hummed when handled. They were never seen again, at least not in France. Weeks later, fishermen off the Orkney coast spoke of strangers coming ashore in silence, dressed in worn leather and speaking Latin through their beards. They built nothing, they bought nothing, and within months they were gone. But sometimes at dusk, people still see faint torches on the ridges, moving in lines too straight for shepherds. Maybe that is folklore, maybe it is not. The truth about the Templars has never lived in books. It lives in geometry, in architecture, in rumour. Every arch they raised hid a ratio, every chapel a cipher. And if you look close enough, even the Scottish hills follow those same invisible lines, as if the land itself was shaped to hide something. Maybe a vault, maybe a tomb, maybe a promise. The Highlands keep their secrets well. Stone does not confess easily, and the heather covers everything that tries to speak. But there is a question that has survived the centuries, buried deeper than any treasure. Not where did the Templars go, but what were they trying to protect? Perhaps they did not run from persecution. Perhaps they were building something far more enduring than an order, a sanctuary, a crypt, a heartbeat beneath the soil, waiting for someone to listen. It began with a death, not the dramatic kind that fills newspapers, but a quiet one, the kind that goes unnoticed except by dust and time. In the summer of 1973, an old antiquarian named Malcolm Kerr was found in his study in Inverness, his hand still clutching a quill, his face turned toward an open book. The fire had gone out hours before. The coroner wrote natural causes, but the locals whispered about the book. They said he had been trying to translate something that refused to be read. The object in question was a small vellum psalter, its cover cracked, its pages yellowed and sweet with age. It had passed through auctions for years, dismissed as a devotional manuscript, until Kerr bought it for the price of a bottle of whiskey. What caught his attention were the margins, strange illustrations of bees, knots, and Gaelic words scribbled sideways between verses. At first glance, they seemed decorative, but Malcolm had an eye for patterns. He noticed that the bees always faced east, the knots always looped in sets of 3, and the glosses repeated every 21 pages. He began to chart them, to measure, to compare. And then, one winter night, he wrote in his notes, "It is not a prayer book, it is a map." After his death, the book passed to the local museum, where it sat for decades behind glass, unstudied and unremarked upon, until a young linguist named Isla Cameron, a student from Aberdeen, noticed something odd while cataloguing images for a digital archive. When the Psalter's pages were scanned under ultraviolet light, the marginal drawings glowed faintly blue, every bee, every knot, connected in a faint lattice of lines, invisible to the naked eye. She followed them, tracing the web until they formed a rough hexagon over the page. At the centre, a mark that looked like a circle with a point, the same symbol carved into an old standing stone near Loch Tay. The next solstice, Isla took the scan to the site. At dawn, as the first light spilled across the hills, she held the image against the rising sun. The lines matched perfectly with the shadow cast by the stone. The Psalter wasn't a map of roads or rivers. It was a map of light. A calendar made of geometry, showing where the sun would strike at certain times of the year, and where it did, something waited. In the weeks that followed, Isla retraced Malcolm's notes, combining his sketches with modern coordinates. The pattern pointed to 6 locations across the Highlands, all near old Templar holdings, all aligned along the same invisible axis. One line crossed directly through Roslin, another ended at a ruined chapel on a hill no one visited anymore. The last entry in Malcolm's journal reads, "They did not build for the living. They built for the return." What that meant, no one knows. But when Isla compared the marks to ancient Gaelic constellations, she realized the design matched not the land but the sky. The Psalter wasn't a guide to where the Templars went. It was a reminder of where to look when the stars align. The night they left La Rochelle, the moon refused to rise. The harbour lay still as ink, the water black and heavy with the scent of salt and smoke. Witnesses later spoke of ships without banners, cogs stripped of colour, sails dyed to match the darkness. They loaded in silence, men moving like ghosts between crates, never speaking above a whisper. The year was 1307, the same year the order was condemned by the Pope, and France turned against its knights. In Paris, the Templar Grand Master burned. In La Rochelle, the survivors vanished. Official records end there, but rumours do not. Dockhands told stories of 12 ships slipping out just before dawn, their holds sealed, their crews sworn to secrecy. Some said they carried gold, others relics stolen from Jerusalem. But one sailor, an old man who claimed to have been a boy that night, said the cargo clanged like stone when moved, and breathed like something alive when the wind passed through the hull. He never spoke of it again. By the time the sun rose, the fleet was gone, swallowed by mist. Weeks passed, then months, and when French ships were sent to hunt them, no wreckage was found. Some believed they had fled to Portugal, others to Cyprus. But there were whispers of another route, one that led north across dangerous waters to a land where the crown had little reach. Scotland. At the time, Scotland was torn by war, its people fierce and distrustful, but among the Northern Isles lived a family sympathetic to the order. The Sinclairs of Orkney, seafarers, masons, and men of curious faith. Their ships roamed far beyond sight of land, and their harbours were deep and hidden among cliffs, a perfect refuge. Local legends from Orkney tell of a winter when strangers came ashore bearing a red cross stitched inside their cloaks. They built temporary shelters from driftwood and stone, and they brought with them chests that were never opened in daylight. The villagers were told they contained relics of saints, though some claimed to hear music when the lids shifted, a faint hum like air trapped in metal. Over time, the strangers melted into the land. Some married, some took new names, others simply disappeared into the hills. One story tells of a cave sealed with iron, its entrance marked by a circle carved into the rock, half above the tide and half below. They called it the breath of the sea, and said that on certain nights the wind that came from within was warm as if from lungs. Centuries later, divers exploring the coast near Orkney reported finding a submerged tunnel leading inland. It was cut by hand, smooth as glass, far older than it should have been. At its deepest point, they found what looked like a stone door. No one has ever opened it. Perhaps that is where the cargo rests, the one that sang beneath the waves, the one the world was never meant to see. Rosslyn Chapel is not a building. It is a cipher carved in stone. From the outside it looks small, a delicate jewel box tucked into the green folds of Midlothian. But step inside and the air changes. The light bends strangely, as if the windows remember another sky. Dust drifts through coloured beams that never fall in the same pattern twice. Every inch is carved. Angels, vines, dragons, cubes. But what matters most is not what you see. It is what you do not. The chapel's true story hides in its gaps, in the silence between its shapes. If you trace the arches with your eyes, you will notice they do not match. The left side of the nave is shorter by a few inches, the right more crowded with figures. To the casual visitor, it looks like the result of medieval imperfection, but Rosslyn is no accident. Every deviation is deliberate. Scholars have measured the columns, mapped the angles, and still they cannot explain why the numbers refuse to align. The stone hums with purpose, but the melody is missing a note. That is where the secret lives, in the negative space. The chapel was commissioned by Sir William Sinclair in the year 1446, a man whose family had ties to the old Templar ports of Orkney. He employed master masons from across Europe, men fluent in the language of geometry. They carved not words but equations, and they left them incomplete. When viewed from above, the floor plan appears lopsided, yet when mirrored perfectly along the central axis, a new pattern appears. A star. 6 points, interlocking, its heart resting directly beneath the apprentice pillar, the most ornate column in the chapel. Some believe this star marks the convergence of hidden chambers. Others think it is symbolic, a map of something unseen. There are whispers that during the equinox, light strikes the chapel's stained glass in such a way that the missing half of the star glows faintly against the far wall, completing the design for only a moment before vanishing. It is as if the building itself remembers how to reveal and conceal in equal measure. Inside Rosslyn there are echoes that do not match footsteps. Instruments that appear in carvings long before they were invented. Even the ceiling hides meaning. The famous cube patterns that dot the vault correspond to musical tones when arranged in sequence. One researcher translated them and found they formed a hymn not of praise but of mourning, perhaps for what was buried there, perhaps for what was lost. Yet no excavation has ever been allowed beneath the chapel's foundation. The church forbids it, officially to preserve the structure, unofficially because of what might lie below. If the rumours are true, Rosslyn is not a monument to faith, it is a lock. And like all locks, it exists to protect something worth hiding. The chapel's carvings do not speak, they listen. And if you stand still enough, you can almost hear the silence shaping itself into words. Walk through any old Scottish village and you will see them, carved into lintels, stitched into faded banners, hidden in coats of arms that no one questions anymore, bees and thistles. Symbols so common they have become invisible. The thistle, of course, is the national emblem, a sign of pride and stubborn survival. But the bee that does not belong here, not by nature, not by tradition, it is a foreign mark, one that should not hum across Highland stone, and yet it does. The earliest examples appear in the 15th century, just after the Sinclairs rose to prominence in Orkney and built Rosslyn Chapel. Golden bees engraved beside thistles on tombs and shields, their wings outstretched as if mid-flight. Historians have always said they were decorative, borrowed from continental art. But look closer, and the pattern changes. The bees are not random, they form words. The hives etched into stone, a line into letters, a lexicon hidden in plain sight. When translated through the Gaelic alphabet, each flower, each bee, corresponds to a sound. Together they spell names, forgotten ones. Names that do not appear in any Scottish registry, but echo faintly in Frankish chronicles. Dagobert, Clovis, Merivech. The same names that belong to the long-haired kings of France, the Merovingians. The bloodline that some claimed carried divinity itself. How could their symbols appear here, in a land they never ruled, unless someone brought them? There are records, thin and scattered, of French masons arriving in Scotland during the late 14th century, seeking refuge after the fall of the Templars. Many found work under Sinclair patronage. They carved what they knew, what they remembered. Some whispered they carried not just tools but relics, fragments of an older faith. The bee, to the Merovingians, was more than an insect. It was a sign of resurrection, of royal spirit, the soul that never dies. To carve a bee was to declare continuity, a hidden inheritance. The thistle, sharp and native, became the guard. Together they formed a code of belonging, foreign blood grafted onto Highland soil. In the archives of Edinburgh, there is a curious document from the year 1482 describing a banner flown at a Sinclair gathering. It bore a green field with a single bee circled by thistles, and beneath it the phrase ex sanguine regale, of the royal blood. No one knows whose royal blood. The record ends there. In modern heraldry, the bee survives in family crests across Scotland, from Perthshire to Inverness, but few can explain why. Some say it honours labour, others say fertility. Yet in certain churches, old and nearly forgotten, stained glass windows show bees hovering near lilies and roses, forming patterns that mirror constellations. The message is clear to those who know how to read it. The bee remembers where it came from, and the thistle remembers who it protects. Together they hum a quiet warning across centuries. The blood still sleeps beneath the heather, but its symbols never stopped speaking. The letter was discovered by accident, wedged behind a false panel in the sacristy of an abbey near Perth. It was written in the year 1461, its parchment browned and curling at the edges. The ink, though faded, still carried the faint scent of iron and oak gall. It was addressed simply to "My brother in Christ" and signed Prior Andrew of Dunfermline. At first, it seemed a harmless fragment of monastic correspondence, full of blessings and scripture. But midway through, the tone shifts. The lines grow frantic. The handwriting slants as if the writer feared being watched. "I have seen the mouth beneath the hill," he wrote, "and it sleeps still. God preserve those who wake it." The phrase caught historians off guard. For centuries it was dismissed as metaphor, the ramblings of a pious mind. Yet the more you read, the less poetic it becomes. The prior describes a journey north, to a hollow of the saints, a place where the ground hums like a bell when struck. He speaks of stone steps spiraling into the earth, of air that grows warmer, not colder, as one descends, and then of an opening shaped like a mouth, carved with symbols too old to name. "It is not a grave," he writes, "it is a passage, the sleeping mouth under the hill." Some scholars connected the phrase to the old Highland legends of hollow hills, fairy mounds, where spirits dwell. But one line in the letter complicates that. The seal of the order remains unbroken, the order. There was only one such order that the Church feared mentioning by name during that time, the remnants of the Templars. If Prior Andrew stumbled upon one of their hidden vaults, his description fits perfectly. A tomb that is not a tomb, a tunnel that breathes. The abbey that preserved his letter had ties to the Sinclairs, who funded repairs in that very decade. It was rumoured that they buried something beneath the choir, something older than the church itself. When excavations were attempted in the 19th century, workers reported hitting a hollow space 6 feet down, then being ordered to stop. No explanation was given. The prior's letter ends abruptly. The last sentence trails off mid-phrase. "If the mouth is opened, the breath will return, and with it the old covenant." No signature, no postscript, as if he had been interrupted. The document was sealed again and forgotten until its rediscovery in 1928. Since then, cryptographers have tried to match its description to known geography. The best theory places it near the Ochil Hills, where ancient tunnels still run beneath ruined monasteries. Locals say there is a hill there that hums after rain, a low vibration that feels alive if you press your ear to the earth. They call it the mouth. No one digs there anymore. The ground is soft, and the wind sometimes sounds like breathing. In the summer of 1984, the rain stopped. For weeks the Highlands lay under a dry, cloudless sky, and the lochs began to shrink. Locals called it the thirsty year, when even the peat burns slowed to a trickle and the ground cracked beneath the heather. Near the village of Kinloch Rannoch, a loch known for its dark mirror like water began to recede, revealing what no one had ever seen before. Beneath the black waterline, the peat pulled back like a curtain, and something unnatural appeared. Not rock, not root, but cut stone, a line of it, perfectly straight. The first to notice was a farmer named Callum Fraser. He was checking his sheep one evening when he saw the reflection of the sunset break oddly across the surface of the loch. Where there should have been water, there was a pale strip running across the mud, shimmering faintly. The next morning he walked down to it. What he found was a causeway 10 feet wide, made of fitted slabs, each carved with strange notches along the edges. It ran from the shore straight into the centre of the loch and vanished under what little water remained, he told the council. They sent archaeologists. The team arrived expecting the remains of an old pier or Viking structure, but the stone was too smooth, too precise. Tests showed it had been cut with tools more advanced than anything from the medieval period. Even stranger, it was made from sandstone that did not exist anywhere near the loch. Someone had brought it there, block by block, centuries before. Along the sides of the stones were faint carvings, circles intersected by lines, and small symbols that looked like bees. The same markings found on Templar graves across Europe. The researchers mapped the path of the causeway, assuming it led to a small island that once stood in the middle of the loch. But when they sent divers to explore, there was no island, only depth. The sonar scans showed something massive beneath the silt, a rectangular shape buried 40 feet below the current lake bed. The divers said the water grew strangely warm near the site, and their compasses spun without direction. One of them swore he heard a low hum, like a heartbeat, echoing through the water. After 3 days, the investigation stopped. Officially, funding ran out. Unofficially, local authorities claimed the structure posed a safety risk and banned further exploration. Within weeks, the drought broke. Heavy rain returned, filling the loch until the causeway vanished again. Callum said he could still see it sometimes, when the wind blew a certain way and the surface rippled just right, a faint line beneath the reflection, leading toward the centre. The villagers began to call it the Black Water Line. No map records it, and every attempt to photograph it fails. But the fishermen still whisper that on still nights, if you listen closely, you can hear water moving over stone, as if the loch itself remembers the road that sleeps beneath. Most visitors never notice it. They walk through Rosslyn Chapel with cameras in hand, staring at the carved angels and vines, but their eyes slide past the north wall where a plain buttress interrupts the symmetry. It looks ordinary, unadorned, as if the mason forgot to finish it, but if you measure carefully, you find it is misaligned by a hand's breadth, shifted just enough to break the perfect geometry of the wall. The other 4 pillars form a pattern of harmony, each one balancing the next, but the 5th sits stubbornly out of place. No one knows why. For centuries it was dismissed as a mistake. But Rosslyn's builders did not make mistakes. They encoded meaning in absence, in silence, in what appears broken but is not. The first clue came from a choir boy in the year 1868, who claimed that when he sang near the 5th pillar, his voice echoed strangely, as though the sound was being swallowed by the wall. The parish priest dismissed him until he tested it himself. The echo did not bounce back. It fell inward, like a door breathing. Decades later, in the 1920s, a restorer noticed a hairline crack running down the side of the buttress. He tapped it with a chisel and heard something hollow. When he reported it to the church board, they ordered him to stop. Officially, it was to prevent damage to the structure. Unofficially, the archives show a letter from a Sinclair descendant asking that the area remain untouched. The letter ends with the phrase, "Let the stair sleep." The idea of a stair seemed ridiculous until ground sensors were used in the early 2000s to map the subsoil around the chapel. The scans showed an anomaly directly beneath the 5th pillar, a void that spiraled downward in a perfect corkscrew shape. It was too deep to be a drain and too precise to be natural. Whatever lay below had been carved deliberately. When the images leaked online, amateur historians called it the hidden stair of Rosslyn. The church denied it, saying the scans were misinterpreted. Yet maintenance workers later confirmed that the temperature near that section of wall is always slightly warmer, even in winter, as if air seeps up from beneath. Some nights visitors report hearing faint rhythmic sounds under the stone, like footsteps far below ground. The guidebooks never mention it, but locals say the 5th pillar marks the entrance to a forgotten chamber, one that mirrors the chapel itself, only upside down. A reflection world, built by the same hands but meant to be hidden, a vault of voices and dust. If that stair exists, it would lead straight into the heart of the hill where Rosslyn sits. Perhaps that is why the echo feels alive. Sound does not vanish there. It travels down, winding into darkness, carrying with it every hymn ever sung, every prayer ever whispered. And maybe, just maybe, an answer waiting in the silence beneath the stone. Deep beneath the stone ribs of Rosslyn, there are stories of a room that sings, not with voices or instruments, but with the air itself. They call it the Chamber of Unfinished Music. No record of its construction exists, yet fragments of it appear in local folk tales as early as the 16th century, always described the same way: a space that responds. The story begins with a mason named Robert of Elgin, who worked under the Sinclairs during the final phase of the chapel's construction in the late 1400s. He wrote of a hidden annex, a circular room walled in polished limestone where no carving was ever completed. He said it was designed to amplify sound until stone could remember it. According to legend, the builders discovered that when a single pure note was sung at the right pitch, the walls would vibrate and a seam would appear where none was visible before. It was not magic. It was resonance. The geometry itself was the key. The chapel above mirrors this principle. Each column and arch forms a ratio linked to musical intervals. The so-called Rosslyn cubes, those curious blocks carved with patterns, correspond to tones. When decoded, they form a sequence, a song of sorts. Some believe that melody, when performed correctly, was meant to open something. In the early 1960s, an engineer named Thomas Winfield tested the idea. Using sound mapping equipment, he recorded vibrations inside the chapel during choir rehearsals. He found one frequency that made the stone near the north transept tremble imperceptibly. A low hum, too deep for human hearing. When amplified, it produced a faint echo beneath the floor, as though another room was resonating in sympathy. He called it the second voice. Winfield died in a car accident before he could publish his findings, but his notes survived. In them he described a set of coordinates that, when plotted, formed a spiral beneath the chapel aligned with the fifth pillar's anomaly. At the centre of that spiral, he marked one word: entrance. In 2006, a group of acoustic architects from Edinburgh University revisited his research using modern equipment. They confirmed that the chapel's interior is not random. It functions as a harmonic chamber, channeling sound waves along hidden paths. They also recorded a single tone that seemed to echo from below, even when no one was singing. It matched the frequency of the human voice at a low A, the same note found in medieval plainsong used by the Templars. Whether by design or coincidence, the geometry of Rosslyn turns that note into motion. Some claim that those brave enough to hum it alone, late at night, can feel a shift beneath their feet as if the ground exhales. A few insist they have seen dust fall from seams that should not move, like a whisper inviting them downward. The Chamber of Unfinished Music may not exist in stone, but it exists in sound, waiting for the right voice to call it awake. When the Templars fell in the year 1307, the world imagined their treasures vanished into the sea. Gold, relics, jewels, all swallowed by history. But the real treasure of the order was not wealth, it was memory. Somewhere in the years that followed their arrest, a convoy of crates left the fortress of La Rochelle under cover of night. Each was stenciled with a red cross and sealed with beeswax. Witnesses later said they rattled not like coins, but like paper, like bone. Whatever they carried, it was alive with meaning. The crates never reached Paris. They were traced to the coast, then to a ship that disappeared north into the fog. Centuries later, in a manor near Stirling, an inventory surfaced during the demolition of an old cellar. It was written in Latin, dated 1421, signed with the mark of a Sinclair steward. It listed the contents of 12 chests received from an unnamed brotherhood. The items were odd: relic fragments, coded documents, reliquaries shaped like bees, and something described only as the record of continuance. The steward noted that the boxes were to be sealed again and placed beyond the crypt under the twin arches. Most historians dismissed it as forgery, a romantic attempt to tie Scotland to Templar myth. But one historian, Alistair Duncan, refused to ignore the details. He tracked the handwriting to an authentic source, a monk from Dunfermline Abbey who had written similar ledgers for the Sinclairs. The ink, parchment, even the phrasing matched. Duncan believed the inventory was real, and the reference to the record of continuance was not symbolic. It was literal. A ledger of names, dates, and births. A genealogy. If the Templars had indeed fled with documents instead of gold, those papers could have recorded the living bloodlines of their founders, the ones they believed descended from something divine. The thought terrified the Church. A book that could trace holy descent through human generations would upend centuries of doctrine. Duncan found evidence that one of the crates resurfaced briefly in the early 1800s, when a Sinclair descendant sold a collection of sealed wax tablets to a London antiquarian. The buyer opened one. Inside was not writing, but pressed bone fragments, arranged like a cross. The rest were never opened, and their location remains unknown. A rumour persists that one chest still lies buried beneath a ruined chapel near the Orkney coast, its contents preserved by salt air and secrecy. What no one disputes is that the Sinclairs kept meticulous records of all their possessions, but in their archives there is a gap, 12 missing pages, the space where that ledger should be. And if those pages ever surface, they will not reveal gold or relics, they will reveal lineage. The most dangerous treasure of all, because it does not shine, it breathes. It has a name. The chalice sat in darkness for centuries, locked behind iron doors and forgotten beneath the dust of a ruined priory. When it was finally found in the summer of 1957, the monks who uncovered it believed they had discovered the Holy Grail. It was small, carved from olive wood, its stem wrapped in silver wire that had blackened with age. A cross was etched into the base, faintly visible beneath centuries of grime. The reliquary was shaped like a cup, but inside there was no jewel, no relic of divine power. There was only a braid of hair and a folded piece of parchment sealed with red wax. The discovery caused brief excitement before being quietly dismissed by scholars. The writing, they said, was indecipherable, the relic unimportant. Yet one line stood out even to the untrained eye, the words Sangreal, written as a single term, Sangreal. It looked like a mistake, but it was not. The difference between a cup and a lineage was a single space. For hundreds of years, people had read it as Holy Grail, but the original Latin, when joined, meant royal blood, a line, not a vessel. The parchment, when carefully unrolled, revealed a list of names written in a steady hand. It began in the East, with familiar ones like Joseph of Arimathea and Mary Magdalene, then continued into centuries of obscurity. The final entry bore a name that no one recognized, written beside a symbol of a bee surrounded by thorns. It matched the insignia found in early Sinclair heraldry. The braid of hair, preserved beneath the parchment, had once been blonde but had darkened with time. It was woven with thread-dyed crimson, as if to remind whoever opened it that blood was the true relic. The monks who handled it reported that the air around the chalice grew warmer, that a faint scent of myrrh lingered for days after. They hid it again, this time not out of reverence, but fear. For if the relic was genuine, it meant that the myth of the Grail had always been a misdirection, a story bent to obscure something far more dangerous. The Church could tolerate legends of a cup. It could not tolerate proof of a bloodline. In 1962, a visiting historian from Paris examined the chalice and noted that the silver band was engraved with a code similar to Templar ciphers used in the 13th century. When translated, it read, "Custodi sanguinem," guard the blood. After that, the relic vanished again, taken by unknown hands. Some say it was moved to Roslin, others that it was buried beneath the loch where the black water line once appeared, but the message remains. The Grail was never a cup to drink from. It was a promise, a record of inheritance. The treasure everyone sought was never meant to hold wine or miracles. It was meant to hold memory, a story of flesh and lineage disguised as faith, hidden in plain sight behind a single word that the world read wrong. In the Highlands, oaths were not written. They were spoken, breathed into the air, bound to the soil itself. The people believed that promises tied to land could never be broken, because the earth remembered. Long after the Templars vanished into legend, the Sinclairs of Orkney and Roslin made their own kind of covenant, one that was never recorded in any royal archive. It began quietly in the late 1400s, after the chapel was built and the last of the stonemasons drifted away. A pact formed between the Sinclairs and the Highland clans who worked their land. In Gaelic, it was called an Cumnant Fala, the Blood Covenant. The clans would guard certain places, cairns and caves, and glens marked with symbols no outsider could read. In return, the Sinclairs would protect the clans, not with coin, but with silence. The land itself became a vault, and the people its living lock. Each generation swore the same words on midsummer night, facing the hills. We keep the stone, we keep the breath, we keep the name. The oath meant different things to different families, but always carried the same warning. To break it was to invite the land's wrath. Old men in the glens still tell stories of those who tried to dig in forbidden ground, how their tools turned to rust overnight, or how the earth swallowed their footprints. The crofters who lived near Roslin refused to plough certain patches of field. They called them the sleeping veins. Beneath them, they said, ran tunnels connecting the chapel to the hills beyond. Only those born under the covenant knew their exact paths. In the year 1634, a Sinclair document records payments made not to labourers or masons, but to keepers of the field. The entry is brief, no names, no explanation, only the symbol of a bee beside it. Historians once thought it referred to beekeepers, but in Gaelic lore, bees were messengers between worlds. The keepers were not tending hives. They were tending memory. During the Highland clearances of the 19th century, when families were driven from their land, many took their secrets with them, yet some refused to leave, saying the covenant forbade it. To abandon the land was to break the lock. One letter from 1827 tells of a crofter named Ewan MacRae who was offered money to sell his hill farm. He declined, saying only, "The stone below will not forgive me." No one knew what he meant until decades later, when a small tunnel was found under his cottage, lined with slate and sealed with mortar. Inside was a carved emblem of the Sinclair cross. The pact had endured. Today few remember the old oath, but in the valleys of Caithness and the moors near Orkney, there are still spots where no one digs, no one builds, and no one asks why. The air hums faintly there, like a voice under the soil, repeating an old promise. The land keeps what the people cannot speak. In the spring of 1681, a Scottish cartographer named Alistair Menzies completed a map of the northern coast. It was meant to be the most accurate rendering of the Highlands ever produced, commissioned by the Royal Society in London. His lines were perfect, his measurements precise, but one detail ruined him. Near the Orkney Isles, where the sea meets the cliffs, he drew a small inlet that did not exist, a narrow curve of land, shaded with meticulous care, labelled only with a single word in Latin, dormian, meaning sleeping. When the map was published, sailors complained that the inlet confused navigation. They called it Menzies' Folly. The Royal Society demanded a correction. Later editions removed the inlet entirely. Yet for reasons no one could explain, Menzies never defended himself. He withdrew from public life and vanished into obscurity. Only one letter survived, sent to his brother shortly before he disappeared. "The map is true," he wrote, "but not to the eye, only to the oath." It made no sense to anyone at the time, but centuries later it would become the key to understanding what he had done. The original print, thought to be destroyed, survived in two places, one in the National Library of Scotland and one in the library of an old Masonic lodge in Edinburgh. Both copies share the same mark, a faint B engraved into the border near the cardinal compass rose. When scanned under ultraviolet light in 2003, researchers found faint symbols drawn in invisible ink along the coastline, forming a pattern identical to the layout of Rosslyn Chapel. The inlet, it turned out, was not an error. It was a code. By aligning the chapel's floor plan with the map, the supposed coastline traced the outline of a valley in Caithness known locally as the Hollow Glen, a place few ever visited because of its unpredictable fog and sudden drops in temperature. Menzies must have known the area intimately. His family had ties to the Sinclairs, and his father had once been their steward. The sleeping he mentioned referred not to the sea but to something buried there, something the map hinted at through geometry rather than geography. The coordinates of the inlet align perfectly with a hill whose base is ringed by standing stones and whose summit bears no vegetation, as if the ground rejects roots. In 1879, surveyors rediscovered the glen and noted that their compasses behaved erratically near its centre, spinning without direction. No magnetic ore exists in that region. They left quickly, unnerved. The corrected maps erased the inlet, but Menzies' sin lives on in those first prints. He had used his craft not to mislead, but to remember, to hide the trail in plain sight. The coastline that never was may still mark the entrance to a crypt that waits beneath the hills, a place that breathes through maps and mistakes, guarded by the silence of ink. In the winter of 1732, Scotland froze. The locks turned to glass, the heather to stone, and the skies hung low and grey for months. Locals called it the Year of the Iron Cold. But to the few who kept records, the frost was not what they remembered most. It was the visitors. They came quietly, dressed not in priestly robes but in thick travelling coats, speaking Latin and Italian to one another, and perfect Gaelic to everyone else. They said they were scholars sent by Rome to study the weather, to collect data on the strange storms that had begun to strike the northern coasts. They carried brass instruments and notebooks sealed in oilskin. But the villagers noticed what they did not measure. They never once looked at the sky. They measured doors. For weeks they travelled from abbey to chapel to manor, noting dimensions, hinges, arches, every doorway, every threshold. In Rosslyn they spent 3 nights underground and refused to say what they found. When asked, their leader, a thin man who signed his name as Father Lucenti, said only, "We study patterns of passage." His words meant nothing to the crofters who fed him, but to those who had heard the legends of the sleeping crypt, they meant everything. By spring, the envoys were gone, their equipment packed, their notes sealed. But soon after, something changed. The Vatican issued a decree restricting access to its own archives, closing sections that had been open for centuries. Officially, it was for preservation. Unofficially, it marked the start of what scholars now call the Era of Silence. Permissions tightened. Requests for Templar records were denied without reason. And back in Scotland, the air itself seemed to shift. The climate cooled again, harsher than before, as if the land had absorbed the secrecy. Letters from that year describe sudden drops in temperature near certain old chapels, frost forming only along their thresholds, never inside. One priest wrote that his breath froze mid-word when he recited Mass at dawn. In Dunfermline Abbey, the altar candles refused to stay lit. The people began to say the weather had changed because the church had tried to measure something it did not understand. Some claimed the envoys had opened one of the old tunnels beneath Rosslyn, that they had stood before a sealed door and heard wind sigh from behind it, warm as a living breath. Whatever they found, they sealed again and left without a word. Father Lucenti's journal, found years later in a private collection in Rome, contains a single drawing, a door framed by frost, its handle shaped like a bee. Beneath it, 4 words written in Latin, sub clave frigus servat. Under the key, the cold preserves. Whether curse or warning, no one can say. But since that winter, Scotland's storms have never truly left. The land remembers when strangers came to measure doors and left with silence, and the weather has obeyed ever since. In the dim hall of an old Freemason lodge in Inverness, a tracing board hangs behind glass. It is painted on oak, cracked with age, and framed in gold leaf so thin it flakes at the corners. To the untrained eye, it looks like any other Masonic design. 2 pillars, an arch, a checkerboard floor, a beehive glowing at the centre, and a rose blooming from a compass. The inscription at the bottom reads, Lux ex tenebris, light from darkness. But in the early 1990s, an architect named Fiona MacLeod noticed something strange while restoring the hall. When she measured the proportions of the board, she realized it matched no known Masonic template. The pillars were too far apart, the arch too narrow, and the rose was not centered between them but tilted slightly to the left. It was a mistake that should not exist. Out of curiosity, she traced the design onto transparent film and began overlaying it on maps of the surrounding area, searching for any alignment that might explain the error. For weeks, nothing matched. Then, late one night, she rotated the overlay 45 degrees and set it over a topographic map of Glen Lyon, a remote highland valley known for its strange cairns and standing stones. Suddenly, everything aligned. The arch followed the curve of the glen's ridge, the pillars lined with 2 ancient stone outcrops, and the beehive rested exactly over a mound labelled on the map as an unnamed cairn. Only, when she checked satellite images, there was no cairn, just grass, a smooth, unnatural rise. Fiona drove there the next day. The road ended miles from the site, so she hiked the rest of the way through mist and bog. When she reached the mound, she realized it was not built of stones at all. The ground was solid beneath her feet, like a single buried structure covered by centuries of soil. She found no markings, no entrance, just a faint circular depression at its summit where rainwater pooled. Beneath the shallow water she noticed something glinting, a pattern of small carved grooves forming the shape of a rose, the same rose from the tracing board. She took photographs, but when she returned a week later, the pool was gone, filled in with earth. It was as if the land had swallowed its secret again. Back at the lodge, she examined the back of the board and found faint writing etched into the wood. Measure the arch when the moon is high. It was signed with a symbol rather than a name, a bee within a compass. Some believe that the board was more than a teaching tool. It was a map left by a Freemason who knew the old Templar code, someone who saw architecture as geography and geometry as confession. The arch does not point upward. It points inward, into the hills, where stone breathes and flowers carved in secret still wait to bloom. The rose was never meant for walls. It was meant for the earth. Every chapel has a keeper, the one who opens the doors before dawn, lights the candles, and tends to the silence. Their names rarely make it into history books, but sometimes it is the nameless who hold the heaviest keys. In Rosslyn and across the small stone churches of the Highlands, there is record of a peculiar lineage of sacristans stretching back to the 1500s. Parish logs list them only by first name, never a surname. Andrew, Elias, Callum, Thomas. Each served for decades. Each lived within walking distance of the chapel, and each died under the same curious circumstances. Clean hands, clay under the nails. The pattern first drew attention in the early 20th century when a historian named Margaret Lethbridge began compiling burial records from Midlothian parishes. She noticed the repetition at once. No family links, no recorded children, yet every successor appeared within a year of the previous keeper's death, always taking the same post, always living in the same small house near the chapel gate. The house still stands, its walls thick with salt from centuries of Scottish rain. Inside, there is a table carved with a simple phrase in Gaelic, the Antalan Bior, the earth is alive. Locals used to joke that the keepers were chosen by the ground itself, that the soil remembered their hands. Some said they were not hired but called. Each spring they would walk barefoot to the nearby burn and wash their hands before Easter, a ritual no one else performed. The last of them, a man known only as Angus, tended Rosslyn until 1961. When he died, they found his palms spotless, yet the beds of his nails packed with dark earth. The priest assumed he had been gardening, but there was no garden, only a patch of disturbed ground near the north wall of the chapel where grass refused to grow. Margaret visited the site months later and noticed small clay fragments scattered across the soil. When she compared them to samples from the chapel's foundation, they matched perfectly. It was as if the keepers had been quietly tending the stone itself, keeping something buried or sealed. She found more evidence in old diaries of priests who had served before the Reformation. One entry from 1547 mentions the watcher of the ground, who hears the breathing of the buried light. No further explanation is given. The church always dismissed such notes as superstition, but the repetition is too precise to ignore. Each generation of keeper leaves no lineage, no possessions, only the same handful of clay in their nails. The locals still tell stories of a man who appears in the fog near Rosslyn's gate when storms gather. His clothes are plain, his eyes pale grey, and his hands always clean. They say he walks to the north wall, kneels, and presses his fingers into the dirt, listening for something beneath. The keeper without a name, still tending the silence that others fear to disturb. The discovery was almost accidental. In the autumn of 1978, while cataloguing heirlooms from an old Sinclair estate near Thurso, a museum archivist named Daniel Moreau found a small cedar chest sealed with wax so brittle it crumbled at his touch. Inside were the usual relics of a forgotten family, rings, letters, a broken compass, until he reached the bottom. There, wrapped in faded silk, lay a scrap of parchment no bigger than a hand. The ink had browned, the edges burned, as if torn from fire. At first glance, it looked like medieval Latin, but when Daniel tilted it to the light, he realized it was written in Occitan, the language of southern France. A single phrase caught his eye. Montségur's ember carried north. He froze. Montségur had been the last fortress of the Cathars, the heretics burned by the church in the year 1244. Legend said that before the flames consumed them, 4 of their number escaped with a hidden treasure, something too sacred to name. No one ever found it. And yet here, centuries later, was a fragment claiming it had survived. The rest of the writing was fragile, almost invisible. Daniel used infrared photography to read the hidden lines. They spoke of a northern refuge and a stone that sings beneath the cross of bees. The description matched nothing in France, but sounded eerily like the folklore surrounding Rosslyn Chapel. He sent a copy of the text to a linguist in Toulouse, who confirmed that the handwriting belonged to the 13th century. The author had signed it simply with the symbol of a flame within a circle. Among Cathar sects, that mark represented the perfecti, the purified ones who carried divine truth through silence. How such a fragment ended up in a Sinclair chest was a mystery. But the Sinclairs had connections to France through their Templar ties, and their ships often sailed between La Rochelle and Orkney. It was not impossible that a Cathar relic travelled north, hidden among their cargo. When Daniel presented his findings to the museum board, they dismissed it as coincidence, a collector's forgery. Yet the chest itself was older than any Sinclair artifact they possessed, its wood traced to the Pyrenees. There were no records of how or when it arrived in Scotland. Daniel visited Rosslyn soon after, bringing with him a photograph of the parchment. Beneath the chapel's arches, he noticed something he had never seen before, a faint carving of a small flame inside a circle, tucked among the vines near the apprentice pillar, the same mark from the Cathar text. He touched it, and the stone was warm, though the air was cold. Some say that warmth never fades. The fragment now sits locked in the museum archives, labelled only as unverified relic. But among those who study the old mysteries, it has another name, the Ember of Montségur, a memory carried through fire, surviving long enough to whisper of a northern refuge and a stone that still sings. In the archives of the British government, among files long forgotten, there exists a folder labelled Operation Lamb. It was declassified in 1994. Its pages heavily redacted, the sentences so full of black ink they read more like lace than text. But what remains tells a story that few expected. During the Second World War, a small team of German researchers travelled through Scotland under the cover of the academic exchange programme. Their papers described them as folklorists studying Celtic architecture and oral traditions. In truth, they were members of the Ahnenerbe, the Nazi institute devoted to tracing supposed Aryan origins through ancient symbols and sacred sites. In the spring of 1941, the group arrived at Rosslyn Chapel. They claimed to be art historians documenting medieval carvings before the war destroyed them. They carried sketchbooks, graphite, and thin parchment. For 3 weeks they lived in a nearby manor, spending each day within the chapel, working by lamplight long after dark. The locals grew uneasy. One villager, a young woman named Elsie Grant, later said she saw them kneeling before the apprentice pillar, their hands pressed flat against the stone, as if listening. They took no relics, she insisted, only rubbings of the walls, pages and pages of symbols transferred onto parchment. They paid well and left suddenly at the end of April, heading toward Orkney. None were seen again. The file reveals that British intelligence had been watching them from the start. The Germans had intercepted whispers about a northern crypt connected to the old Templar network. A vault believed to hold sacred knowledge carried from Jerusalem to France and then to Scotland. They called it Der Wolfbau, the wolf's burrow, a name chosen to suggest both predation and protection. Agents were ordered to monitor their movements, but not interfere unless they attempted to remove artifacts. When the war ended, Allied forces recovered crates of documents from Berlin, including maps and sketches of Roslin and the surrounding glens. One sheet bore the heading Das Lamm, the Lamb. It showed the chapel floor plan, overlaid with lines radiating outward like a compass, each pointing towards specific hills and cairns. MI5 translated the notes and realized the lines aligned with sites long rumored to be linked to the Templar escape routes. The Germans had found the same pattern scholars centuries before had failed to decode, but whatever they discovered, they left behind. The rubbings, when finally returned to Britain, were examined and found coated with fine gold dust, residue from the stone itself. No explanation was offered. The documents were sealed again. Operation Lamb was closed. Yet the chapel seemed different after the war. Visitors spoke of a low hum near the pillars, a faint vibration when the sun hit the stained glass just right. Some said the Germans had awakened something. Others said they had merely listened more carefully than anyone else. The wolf and the lamb, hunter and prey, both gone, leaving only silence that still breathes beneath the stone. Beneath every legend lies another, waiting quietly under the first layer of truth. For centuries, people believed Roslin's crypt ended at a single stone wall. Priests called it the terminus, the end of the passage that ran beneath the chapel. But in 1972, during a restoration meant to strengthen the foundation, workers drilling near that wall noticed something strange. Their tools vibrated as if hitting hollow space. When they placed their palms against the stone, they felt a faint current of air, colder than the stone itself. It meant one thing: there was space beyond. The church halted the work immediately, citing structural risk. But one man, an engineer named Peter Graham, kept the readings. They showed an empty void, roughly 10 feet beyond the wall, wider than the known crypt, sealed by a layer of unusually dense limestone. In his notes, Peter called it the second chamber. He believed the wall, everyone called the end, was in fact a false terminus built to hide another descent. The pattern was familiar. Templar architecture often used deception as defense. A vault within a vault, an illusion of completion. What came next turned rumor into obsession. In 2002, a university team scanned the chapel grounds using ground-penetrating radar. They confirmed the presence of an anomaly, exactly where Peter's measurements had predicted, a circular space connected by what appeared to be a spiral shaft. It descended deeper than the instruments could map, stopping abruptly at a dense mass that returned no signal. The images were leaked online, but the church dismissed them as errors caused by natural fissures. Still, witnesses from the survey claim they saw the scanner flicker every time the device passed over a specific point in the crypt floor, as if responding to some hidden rhythm. One of them joked that the stone was breathing. A later examination of the chapel's architecture revealed something more unsettling. Every column and arch above the crypt mirrors an unseen pattern below. The spiral that appears in the radar aligns perfectly with a carved design on the chapel ceiling known as the Ladder of Light. The same symbol appears in medieval texts describing equinox rituals, where sunlight falling at a precise angle revealed hidden mechanisms in stone. Local law still speaks of the crypt's door that opens only when the balance of day and night is perfect, when light and shadow weigh the same. Some say the spiral beneath Roslin unwinds itself then, releasing air older than time, air so cold it burns. Whether that is truth or myth, no one can prove, because the site is sealed, guarded under heritage law. But every spring and autumn, when the equinox comes, visitors gather quietly near the chapel. At the exact moment the sun divides the sky, the air inside changes. A single gust moves through the crypt, colder than before, whispering across the walls. A breath from the second door, waiting patiently for someone brave enough to listen. In the summer of 1991, heavy rain washed part of a hillside near Roslin Chapel into the valley below. Beneath the soil, workers uncovered a small stone chamber, sealed with clay and lined with rough slabs. The discovery was kept quiet for weeks, until archaeologists arrived to examine it. What they found inside did not belong to any known burial record. 3 interments lay side by side, a man, a woman, and a child. No markings, no inscriptions, no trace of a coffin, only the faint shimmer of bronze medallions resting on their chests. Each medallion bore the same symbol, a single bee with its wings outstretched. The bones were arranged with care, the heads facing east toward the chapel. The man's skeleton showed signs of healed wounds and the thickened wrists of a warrior. The woman's hands were clasped together, holding what looked like a fragment of vellum hardened with time. The child's bones were smaller than anyone wanted to see. When the fragment was lifted from her grasp, it revealed faint Latin words inked in brown. Non pro coronis, pro memoria. Not for crowns, for memory. The phrase puzzled everyone. It was not a prayer, not an epitaph. It was a statement. The artifacts were taken to Edinburgh for study, but the site itself was resealed at the request of the local parish. Officially, it was to prevent looting. Unofficially, it was because of what happened next. The team that handled the remains reported an unusual residue on the bones, a thin coating of beeswax mixed with ash. The substance was ancient, predating even the chapel above. Some believed it was part of a preservation ritual, the same kind used by early Templar healers to prepare relics for burial. The radiocarbon tests gave conflicting results. The man's bones dated to the 14th century, the woman's to the 15th, and the child's nearly 100 years later. 3 lives, separated by time, yet placed together as if reunited after centuries apart. No documents mentioned such a burial. No family claimed the site. When the bones were returned to the chamber, the bronze bees were left untouched. The archaeologists could not agree on their meaning. To some they symbolized resurrection, to others loyalty, or even lineage. One researcher noted that when sunlight entered the chamber through a crack in the wall, it fell directly onto the child's medallion, making the wings of the bee glow gold. It looked alive. Theories spread quickly. Some said the knight was one of the last Templars who fled France. Others claimed the woman carried the bloodline they sought to protect. The child, they whispered, was the final link, buried with both so that the secret could never be traced. The phrase on the vellum made sense then. Not for crowns, for memory, not to rule, but to remember. The chamber has been sealed again, hidden beneath moss and heather. The bones are silent now, but silence is only another way of speaking. Sometimes what refuses to answer still tells the truth. Truth is never free. It demands something in return, something heavier than gold or stone. When the discovery of the 3 skeletons near Roslin became public in the year 2004, the world divided overnight. Some called it the greatest archaeological find in Scottish history. Others called it blasphemy. The bones were ordinary in form, but extraordinary in implication. If the stories about the Templars and their hidden bloodlines were true, then these remains could change everything the Church had ever claimed to own. Scientists offered to test the DNA. Politicians urged caution. Priests begged silence. and I stood there, caught between them all, feeling the Highlands breathe around me as if the land itself were listening. The debate that followed stretched for years. Geneticists argued about contamination, ethics committees fought over permission, and somewhere in the noise the bones became symbols instead of people. The government wanted proof, the church wanted quiet. The families of the archaeologists who first opened the chamber just wanted it left alone, but the pressure grew. A single strand of hair, they said, could settle centuries of myth. Was the knight a Sinclair? Was the woman a descendant of the old blood they called Sangreal? Was the child proof that the line survived? Each question promised revelation, but beneath every promise lurked a cost. I remember visiting the site one evening in autumn, long after the researchers had left. The air was cold enough to bite, and the wind moved through the heather like whispered argument. I placed my hand on the soil where the chamber slept, and the earth felt alive, restless. It did not want to be opened again. The land has a way of knowing when it is being watched. DNA is powerful, but it has no soul. It can trace blood, not purpose. It can reveal lineage, not legacy. And in our hunger to prove what we believe, we often forget that belief is what gave these stories life in the first place. A result printed on paper cannot capture the weight of centuries carried in silence. As scientists prepared their instruments, the church released a statement urging restraint. They quoted scripture about faith over evidence, but everyone knew it was fear. Fear that what lay in the blood might confirm what they had spent ages trying to bury. In the end, the tests never happened. The bones were reinterred quietly, sealed again beneath new stone. No announcement, no ceremony. Only the wind attended. Proof remained out of reach, and maybe that was the mercy of it. Some doors are meant to stay closed, not because the truth is dangerous, but because it cannot survive the light we force upon it. When I left that hill, the air shifted behind me, carrying the sound of the loch in the distance. It almost sounded like a voice, soft and steady, saying that answers are not the end of mystery, they are the price of it. The storm had been building all day, a slow rolling weight pressing against the highlands like a held breath. By nightfall, the rain had stopped, but the air still carried its charge. Inside the old manse on the edge of the glen, 12 people gathered in a circle lit only by candles. They were not politicians or priests. They were keepers, descendants of families who had guarded pieces of a story for centuries. Sinclair, MacLeod, MacGregor, names that carried the weight of both myth and duty. In the centre of the table lay the ledger, its leather cracked, its pages yellowed by time. Every name inside it had been written by hand. Knights, masons, monks, and wanderers. It was not treasure, but it was power. The kind of power that changes the way nations see themselves. For weeks the question had been rising like a tide, what to do with it now that the world had begun to notice. Rome had asked to see it, politely at first, then with letters bearing red wax seals. London had sent officials posing as historians. Universities offered digitization grants, the soft promise of preservation wrapped around the harder truth of control. Each invitation sounded noble, and each one meant the same thing. Once the ledger left Scotland, it would never return. The 12 had gathered to decide. The oldest among them, a man named Angus Sinclair, spoke first. His voice was thin but certain. He said that silence was not cowardice, it was stewardship. The ledger had survived wars, reformations, and the slow decay of memory itself. It would survive this too, if they let it sleep. Others argued that keeping it secret only fed the myth that truth buried too long becomes rot. A woman from Inverness said the world deserved to know. Her candle shook as she spoke, the flame flaring and shrinking like a heartbeat. The discussion turned to whispers. No votes, no speeches, just nods. The grammar of assent handed down through generations of keepers who understood that the fewer the words, the stronger the promise. One by one, they looked at the book, then at each other, and gave the smallest sign of agreement. It was decided. The ledger would stay in Scotland. Not in Rome, not in London, not online. It would rest where it had always belonged, sealed in stone, guarded by silence. When the meeting ended, the wind outside had grown calmer, as if the storm had been waiting for their answer. They left without ceremony, each candle extinguished with a breath. In the dark, the ledger waited, its ink older than the nation itself, its truth unread but alive. Outside, the Highlands exhaled, and for a moment, the air seemed to hum with quiet approval. Some secrets are not meant to be exposed. They are meant to be remembered by those who understand that silence is not emptiness, it is protection. It is the oldest form of faith. The morning they sealed the crypt, the Highlands were silent, wrapped in a fog so thick it seemed the world was holding its breath. No press, no archaeologists, no priests. Only 4 men and 1 woman stood at the mouth of the chamber, their boots sunk in wet earth, their faces pale in the weak light. The ledger had been hidden, the bones returned. What remained now was to close the place that had waited too long to be found. The air inside the crypt was colder than the ground above, the kind of cold that feels alive. Every sound was swallowed before it could echo. The walls still carried the faint vibration from the chamber of unfinished music, though the tone had dulled. The resonance key, that perfect pitch which once opened the inner wall, had been detuned. They struck the tuning stone one last time, and instead of a clear hum, it gave a low sigh, like breath leaving a body. That was how they knew it was time. They began stacking stone upon stone, each block marked with chalk and numbered to ensure no mistake. The smallest man in the group, a mason whose great-grandfather had worked on the Rosslyn restorations, whispered a prayer in Gaelic between each placement. It was not a plea for forgiveness, but for remembrance. He said that when the last stone was set, the past would sleep again. The woman held the final piece, a carved slab of sandstone no larger than her hand. Upon it, a single bee, its wings spread wide. The carving was simple, almost crude, but it glowed faintly where the mist touched it. She pressed it into the seam between 2 larger stones, just high enough that the morning sun, when it finally broke through, would reach it for a few seconds each day. The bee, she said softly, would be the guardian. No one else spoke. The final stones went in. The gap shrank, then vanished, the line between air and stone closing like a wound. When it was done, the mason stepped back, his hands trembling from cold and something deeper. He wiped the chalk dust from his palms and turned away without looking back. The others followed, their breath rising in thin white trails. They did not mark the site. No plaque, no cross, no coordinates. Only the bee remained, already darkening as lichen began to settle over it. By spring, it would vanish completely, folded into the green memory of the hill. As they walked back toward the glen, the woman paused and listened. For a moment, she thought she heard a faint hum beneath the ground, the ghost of that ancient resonance now fading into silence. Maybe it was only the wind moving through the stones. Maybe not. Either way, the mouth was sealed, and the story returned to earth, stone to stone, sound to stillness. The Highlands kept their secret once more, quiet and eternal. Dawn breaks slow across the moor, the kind of dawn that doesn't rise so much as seep through the mist. The heather glistens with dew, the sky the colour of pewter. Nothing moves, not even the sheep that usually wander the ridge. The world feels paused, caught in a breath between centuries. There is no sign of what lies beneath. No marker, no monument. Only a narrow path, worn into the grass by footsteps that do not remember why they began. The crypt sleeps below, sealed in silence, but something lingers above. It's in the way the air hums when you breathe, a faint vibration you feel in your chest rather than hear. The chapel on the hill, Roslin, stands waiting as it always has. Its stones shadowed by carvings that seem to shift when the light hits them. The apprentice pillar still spirals upward, frozen mid-story. The fifth buttress still leans by a hand's breadth. And if you listen closely, you might think the building itself is alive, sighing softly, as if relieved that its secret remains unspoken. Tourists come now, cameras in hand, reading plaques about masons and myths, never noticing the faint pattern in the floor tiles that maps to the shape of a bee. The guides speak of Gothic art, of mystery and devotion, and they are not wrong. But they do not mention the vibration that sometimes hums through the chapel at dawn, the same frequency the crypt once carried. When you stand in the nave and let your breath slow, the sound almost aligns with your heartbeat. Some say it's the wind, others say it's the stone, remembering what it was built to guard. The moor itself keeps its own kind of language. Every year, new growth hides the footprints, and every winter the frost reveals them again, faint but insistent, as if the land refuses to let the memory fade. A bee sometimes lands on the chapel glass. It shouldn't be there, not in this cold, yet it hovers near the carvings, tracing the same line across the window every morning. Perhaps it's coincidence. Perhaps it's a sign. The world above and the world below are never truly separate. They breathe through each other, whispering in the grammar of weather, shadow, and sound. No treasure gleams here. No revelation waits to rewrite history. Only symbols, quiet and stubborn, choosing to speak without words. A cross etched in a forgotten pew, a spiral in the dust. A melody that hums when no one is near. The Templars are gone, the ledger is sealed, but the story remains, scattered like pollen across time. You can't hold it, but you can feel it when you walk the path at sunrise, and the mist brushes your face like breath from an older world. That's all that's left above ground. Not proof, not power, just a presence that refuses to die, a truth too sacred for speech, choosing instead to hum softly in the air until someone listens.